The year was 1980, and the bodybuilding world was still trying to make sense of what had just happened in Sydney, Australia. The Mr. Olympia stage had turned into a battlefield of controversy when Arnold Schwarzenegger came out of a 5-year retirement to claim his 7th title. At first glance, it looked like the triumphant return of an icon. But for many, it wasn't a victory, it was a scandal. The crowd was split, the competitors outraged, and the backstage scene was chaos. In magazines and gyms everywhere, people were saying the same thing. Arnold won because of his name, not his physique. It felt like the outcome had been decided before the athletes even stepped on stage. That moment marked the beginning of a major crisis of trust inside the IFBB, the federation running the sport. Among the most furious were Mike Mentzer, Frank Zane, and Boyer Coe, 3 bodybuilding legends who decided to take a bold stand. They announced a boycott of the 1981 Mr. Olympia, accusing the contest of manipulation and favoritism. It was a risky move, but in their eyes, it was the only way to expose what they saw as pure injustice. Suddenly, the biggest event in bodybuilding was under suspicion. Fans who once saw the Olympia as the pinnacle of fairness and physical excellence were now starting to see signs of politics and shady backstage deals. Trust in the competition had never been so shaken. Still, the show had to go on. With many top names out, the stage was open for new competitors to shine. For some, it was a golden opportunity. For others, a rigged game. The fate of the Olympia would now be decided in Columbus, Ohio, and everyone knew this edition would carry the heavy burden of proving whether the sport still had any credibility left. But one question hung in the air, echoing among athletes and fans alike. Could the ghost of Sydney be erased? Or was the 1981 Olympia doomed to repeat history, and maybe make it even worse? Just when everyone thought his time had passed, Franco Columbu shocked the world with an announcement no one saw coming. The 1976 champion, known for his incredible strength and charisma, was making a comeback. To many, it felt like the return of a hero. To others, a red flag that Sydney's controversy might repeat itself. After all, Franco wasn't just a former champion. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger's best friend, the man at the center of the most disputed Olympia in history. Franco wasn't just a bodybuilder. He was a survivor. In 1977, during the world's strongest man competition, he suffered a devastating injury, tearing the tendons and ligaments in his knee while carrying a refrigerator on his back. Doctors were blunt. His career was over. If he was lucky, they said, he'd walk again without pain someday. But Franco refused to accept that fate. He built his own rehab program, turning his body into a living laboratory of willpower and resilience. While most people saw him as a lost cause, Franco spent hours walking backward upstairs, stepping sideways, and inventing unusual exercises to retrain his knee. Every step defied medical logic and proved his lifelong belief that the body is only as limited as the mind allows. Slowly, he walked again, then trained again, and eventually, he started dreaming of the stage once more. During the filming of Conan the Barbarian in 1981, disaster struck again. Franco re-injured his knee after jumping off a rock. Anyone else would have quit, but not him. Inspired by Arnold's comeback the previous year, Columbu decided to do the same. Return from injury, defy the impossible, and chase the world's most prestigious title. His preparation was intense. Franco trained under the sun wearing nothing but shorts, showing off the dense, powerful physique that still impressed everyone. Yet behind that confidence, tension filled the air. The 1981 Olympia was once again promoted by Arnold and Jim Lorimer, the same duo behind the previous year's controversial event. For many athletes, that sounded like a warning sign. Fans and competitors began asking themselves, was Franco's comeback a coincidence or the script for another predictable ending? Would the Columbus stage become the site of a sports miracle or the scene of another scandal that would forever stain the Mr. Olympia's credibility? The 1981 Olympia stage was set, and with it came faces and stories that would define one of the most controversial events of bodybuilding's golden era. With the big names gone due to the boycott, a new generation of athletes saw their chance to make history. It was their moment to prove that bodybuilding could still be about merit, not influence. And as they stepped into the spotlight, each carried a unique journey marked by pain, ambition, and hope. Among them all, Chris Dickerson stood out as the clear favorite. Runner-up in 1980, he was the living example of balance and grace. His flawless symmetry and almost artistic stage presence made him a critic's darling and a crowd favorite. Ignoring the boycott, Dickerson returned more determined than ever to claim the title many believed had already been his the year before. His presence wasn't just physical, it was theatrical, a masterclass in control and perfection. On the other end of the spectrum was Tom Platz, the charismatic Golden Eagle. No one trained with the same intensity as he did. Owner of the most legendary legs in bodybuilding history, Tom had completely transformed his body and mindset since the Sydney fiasco. He'd gone from 195 to 245 pounds, about 88 to 111 kilograms, and every muscle seemed to pulse with passion. Platz embodied pure love for the sport, a man who trained with his heart and competed with his soul. Fans adored him like a rock star. Then there was Callender, the powerhouse from Canada. With massive pecs and arms carved from stone, he returned hungry for redemption after a frustrating tie the previous year. He trained 6 hours a day, twice a day, driven by discipline and conviction. For Callender, that Olympia wasn't just about a title. It was about proving that relentless hard work could triumph over politics. His presence on stage was intimidating, a body sculpted by persistence and faith. Meanwhile, Padilla, the eternal giant killer, continued to defy the odds. Standing just 5'2", 1.57 m, he was often underestimated, but he made up for it with flawless proportions and a physique that looked like it had been carved from marble. For the first time, he followed a strict diet to the letter and arrived on stage in the best condition of his life. Danny looked ready to silence the critics and finally earn the respect that had eluded him for years. And then there was Juice Up Will Kosh, the quiet, methodical German, one of Arnold's protégés. Fresh off a win over Platz at the 1980 Mr. Universe, he brought classic symmetry and razor-sharp conditioning to the stage. Though not considered a favorite, his flawless form and disciplined performance would make him one of the night's most overlooked competitors. Each of these men carried a story of struggle and determination. But what they didn't know was that no matter how prepared they were, nothing could shield them from what was about to unfold in Columbus. The fate of that stage would be decided not just by muscle, but by the heavy weight of controversy once again surrounding the Olympia. October 1981. The Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Columbus, Ohio, was packed. 4,500 fans filled every seat, buzzing with excitement, murmuring, and most of all, demanding answers. After the scandal in Sydney, the audience wanted justice. They wanted a clean Olympia, fair, transparent, and free of favoritism. This was more than a competition. It was bodybuilding's chance at redemption. The atmosphere was electric, almost tangible. Every competitor who stepped on stage was met with a mix of cheers and suspicion. Boos came fast, but the cheers came louder. The crowd wasn't there just to watch, they were there to judge. It felt like every fan had become an unofficial referee, ready to protest at the first sign of bias. The stage lights reflected off the athletes' oiled physiques and off the tense faces of the judges and organizers. It was impossible to ignore. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of anxious silence between each pose and announcement. The fans wanted to believe that 1980 had been a fluke, a one-time mistake. Everyone hoped this night would mark a fresh start for the sport. The athletes, meanwhile, felt the pressure like never before. They knew they weren't just competing against one another. They were fighting the shadow of Arnold himself. One wrong move, one questionable decision, and the boos would rain down like a storm. Even the veterans backstage were nervous. The crowd had the power to destroy reputations in seconds. The judges took their places, pins in hand, trying to stay composed amid the deafening noise. Outside, fans waved magazines and posters, shouting their favorites' names. The whole city seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the event. The Olympia had never felt so intense or so unpredictable. But no one could have imagined that this collective craving for justice would end in pure disappointment. What was supposed to be bodybuilding's rebirth would instead become its most shameful night. Columbus wouldn't just witness a championship. It would witness an explosion of outrage, boos, and disbelief that would scar the sport forever. If there was one thing that would define the fate of the 1981 Olympia, it was the judging system. Trying to rebuild its credibility after the previous year's disaster, the IFBB decided to implement a new scoring method. The intention was good, to bring more transparency to the process, but the result was the exact opposite. The system ended up creating loopholes that made the competition even more confusing and, as many would later say, unfair. The formula looked simple enough. 3 rounds, symmetry, mandatory poses, and individual routines, each worth up to 20 points. At the end, the scores were added up and the highest total won. But there was a major flaw. Just 1 or 2 generous judges could completely change the outcome. There was no clear limit to how ties were handled, and high scores given out of respect for veteran competitors often pushed big names straight to the top. That's exactly what happened with Franco Columbu. Despite showing a noticeably unbalanced physique, a thick upper body paired with underdeveloped legs, he received almost perfect scores from a few judges. Among them was Franco Fassi, a fellow Italian, whose impartiality was immediately questioned. The favoritism was obvious. 2 friendly judges were enough to turn Columbu from an underdog into the contest leader. The irony was brutal. The only judge who actually penalized Franco, Belgian official Jacques Blommaert, had his score thrown out for being the lowest extreme. That technical detail was the final blow. The system automatically eliminated both the highest and lowest scores for each competitor, which in practice erased the one truly critical evaluation of Columbu. The result was absurd. The average of the remaining scores placed him at the top of the rankings. Backstage, head judge Roger Schwab could already see the disaster unfolding. Though responsible for overseeing the judging process, he didn't have a vote himself. Later, in interviews, he admitted that during the tallying of scores, he realized things had spiraled out of control. "I knew it was going to be the biggest booing contest in history," Schwab said. What was supposed to be bodybuilding's redemption night turned into yet another scandal. The promised transparency vanished under favoritism and systemic flaws. Then came the most anticipated moment of the evening. The lights dimmed, silence filled the Veterans Memorial Auditorium, and the announcer began revealing the final placings. The crowd, tense but hopeful, wanted to believe this time would be different, that justice would prevail. But what followed was a storm of collective outrage that would go down as one of the darkest nights in bodybuilding history. When Jusup Wilkosh's name was called in 6th place, the audience reacted calmly. That one made sense. But the next announcement hit like a punch. Danny Padilla, the giant killer, in 5th. The boos began instantly. People stood up, shouting, some even crying out of anger. Many believed Padilla had the best physique on stage, perfect proportions, flawless conditioning, and seeing him placed that low was the first red flag. The uproar only grew. Roy Callender in 4th drew curses and disbelief from the crowd, which had already lost faith in the judging. But when the announcer called Tom Platz in 3rd, the auditorium erupted. It was unbelievable. The night's most charismatic, passionate, and muscular athlete had been robbed. The boos became a deafening roar, thousands of voices shouting "fix" and "rip off" in unison. Then came the breaking point. Chris Dickerson, announced in 2nd place. The audience's last hope, the man most considered the rightful champion, had been denied once again. Chaos broke out. Coins, bottles, and programs were thrown toward the stage. The noise was so intense the announcer could barely continue speaking. And then, the final blow. The winner of the 1981 Mr. Olympia is Franco Columbu. The crowd exploded, but not with cheers. It was pure rage, frustration, and disbelief. The boos thundered through the walls as some fans stormed out in protest. This wasn't just disappointment over a bad result. It was a crowd that felt betrayed. Sensing the danger, Joe Weider and Arnold Schwarzenegger refused to go on stage. The unpleasant task of presenting the trophy fell to Ben Weider. Smiling and seemingly oblivious to the fury around him, Franco raised the trophy beside his wife. The official photos were taken backstage, far from the enraged audience. And so, instead of a celebration, the 1981 Olympia ended as another black mark on the sport. A champion booed off the stage and a crowd that swore never to forget what they had witnessed in Columbus that night. The morning after felt like the aftermath of a war. In magazines, newspapers, and gyms around the world, there was only one topic of conversation: the scandal. Franco Columbu's victory didn't just divide opinions. It shattered the credibility of the Mr. Olympia and stained the IFBB's name for years to come. What was meant to be a story of resilience had become a lasting symbol of favoritism and manipulation. Among the athletes, the outrage was obvious. Danny Padilla, visibly furious, didn't hold back. He called the result an insult to the intelligence of any bodybuilding fan and said Franco represented everything a Mr. Olympia shouldn't be. No cuts, no legs, and completely out of proportion. For Danny, that night killed whatever hope was left that merit could still outweigh politics and backroom influence. Not everyone reacted with anger, though. Tom Platz, the crowd's overwhelming favorite, chose the high road. Even though he was one of the most unfairly treated competitors of the night, he was also one of the few who stepped onto the stage to congratulate Franco with a genuine handshake. His grace under pressure earned him even more respect and cemented his image as a symbol of humility and true love for the sport. Platz knew that even if the trophy wasn't his, the fans' hearts were, and always would be. The media was ruthless. Bodybuilding magazines and sports columnists described the event as the most booed contest in the history of the sport. Headlines showed photos of fans shouting, athletes' bewildered expressions, and chairs being kicked over at the end of the ceremony. For the bodybuilding world, that night hadn't ended. It echoed like an open wound. Franco, on the other hand, remained unfazed. In interviews, he firmly defended his win, insisting that he won by 5.5 points and that there was no doubt about the result. To him, the victory symbolized perseverance, not scandal. And indeed, he never showed regret. He retired right after the event, leaving the stage as champion but surrounded by controversy. In the end, the 1981 Olympia became more than just a contest. It was a bitter lesson about power, favoritism, and the fragility of trust between athletes, judges, and fans. To this day, it's remembered not for the champion's physique, but for the roar of the crowd, a sea of voices booing in defense of what they believe to be the true spirit of bodybuilding: fairness. The 1981 Mr. Olympia stands as the lowest point in the IFBB's credibility. What was meant to celebrate strength and human perseverance instead became a symbol of everything fans feared most: politics, favoritism, and broken trust. Even now, athletes and fans alike still remember that night as the most controversial result in professional bodybuilding history. Despite all the suspicion, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Franco Columbu have always denied any manipulation. According to them, the win was achieved within the rules. But for fans and the press, it seemed impossible to separate the friend from the promoter, the athlete from the politician. Franco's victory, coming right after Arnold's controversial comeback in 1980, was seen as yet another blow to the sport's integrity, the second in 2 consecutive years. The backlash was so intense that the IFBB was forced to act. In the years that followed, the federation completely overhauled its judging system and established new standards for selecting judges and promoters. The goal was to restore public trust and ensure that history wouldn't repeat itself. Those reforms shaped the competition structure that, in many ways, still stands today. Meanwhile, Franco Columbu retired immediately after his win, saying he didn't want to be greedy and had already proven everything he needed to. His farewell was quiet but clouded by controversy, a silent exit after a title many still believe wasn't truly earned. For the fans, though, the true champion that night wasn't the one who held the trophy. It was Tom Platz, the man who proved that the spirit of bodybuilding goes far beyond results. His humility in the face of injustice, his relentless work ethic, and his genuine love for the sport turned him into an eternal icon, the moral winner of 1981. In the end, the 1981 Olympia became a timeless lesson, a reminder that no title is worth more than the trust of the fans, and that, on the stage of life, true greatness isn't measured by trophies, but by the integrity of those who chase them. The 1981 Mr. Olympia went down in history, not for the muscles, but for the booing that never faded. It was the contest where the crowd's voice drowned out the judges, where glory met distrust, and where the passion for the sport proved its strength. That night marked the end of an era dominated by Arnold and his allies, and the beginning of a new generation of athletes, more technical, more conditioned, and above all, more aware of the importance of fairness in bodybuilding. What also became clear, however, was the power of politics behind the scenes. For the second year in a row, the IFBB watched its credibility crumble before the eyes of the world. The 1981 Olympia left a scar, but also a lesson. When favoritism takes the stage, the sport loses its soul. Still, it was that very scandal that forced deep changes and paved the way for the evolution of modern bodybuilding. The irony is that, despite the controversy, this episode actually strengthened the myth of Mr. Olympia. It became not just the stage for the greatest physiques on Earth, but the theater of raw human emotion, ambition, pride, perseverance, and, at times, even betrayal. Mr. Olympia doesn't just showcase muscles, it reveals human nature itself. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in the audience in 1981, would you have booed the result or applauded Franco Columbu? Who do you think was the real moral champion that night? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read what you think about this moment that changed the sport forever. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now. Then hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes about classic bodybuilding and the legends who shaped the sport. And of course, if you want to keep diving deeper into this world of glory and controversy, click the video on your screen right now. There, I tell the full story of the 1980 Mr. Olympia, the scandal that set the stage for all the chaos of 1981. I'll see you there, because the history of bodybuilding, my friend, is built not only on muscle, but on memory.